So immediately when you're reading the Bible, if you don't know anything about the Bible and you come through and you go Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, and all of a sudden you're a Jew, and you come across Ruth, you go, what? Ruth? Why do we have a book of the Bible named after a woman? Now, in the biblical sense, particularly the New Testament sense, the Christian sense, women are held in high esteem. They are elevated. I think I told you last week that I'm marching through a book about Julius Caesar, and it's been quite remarkable, the things that I've learned. I guess I didn't pay much attention to world history when I was in college. But Julius Caesar, he defeated the Gauls, which was France. He defeated the Germans. He defeated Great Britain, North Africa. It's called the Roman Empire for a reason. And anytime he went into a city, if they resisted him, if they surrendered, he'd let them pay tribute and so forth. Alexander the Great did the same thing. But if they resisted him and he went in, he would sometimes kill all the men, women, and children. But other times he would go in and kill all the men and put the women and children into slavery. And so you can imagine the heartache. That's these events. One reason I'm reading it right now is because all these events take place 40 years before Jesus Christ. If you're not familiar with when Caesar lived, it's the Gaul Wars were in 50 BC, and he was murdered, I think, and I've not got there, but I think it's in the mid-40s, early 40s, so about 40 years before Christ. And then his nephew is Augustus Caesar, the son of his sister, and he becomes Caesar Augustus, and that's when Jesus is born. So my point is, whenever you come across women, to have a book of the Bible named after a woman is just really breathtaking when you think about it in the times. And God names 2 books of the Bible after women, and the other, of course, is Esther. And Esther comes a little later in the story. They are contrast in this way that Ruth begins with a famine and ends with a feast, a celebration over the birth of a baby. And specifically, David the king is born. The last word, if you want to flip over and look at chapter 4, the last word in the book of Ruth is David. Then you ought to circle that, because that's when he shows up in the Bible. And he is connected with Ruth. And that's quite a thing, too, that Ruth is in the line of Jesus Christ, and she is connected with David. So Ruth begins with a famine. That's chapter 1. It ends in this celebration and feast. Well, the book of Esther begins with a feast. And that's, if you remember the story at all, the queen was supposed to come in and present herself to the king, and she refused. And the king defrocked her, removed her from being queen, and made a new queen. And Esther won the beauty contest. And I'm not being facetious, it really was a beauty contest, and Esther won it. So it begins with a feast, and then it ends with a funeral. So funerals in chapter 1 of Ruth, celebrations in chapter 4. Celebrations in Esther, chapter 1, funerals in Esther, chapter 9 and chapter 10, because people are dying. So the contrast is there. The other interesting thing about these 2 books, and I'm going to lay Esther aside after this comment, the other interesting thing is that in the book of Esther, God is never mentioned. He's just in the background. There's no question he's there, and there's no question he's directing it. But it's like a director behind the camera directing the scenes, and you never see it. So if Esther were a movie and you were to see the lines, have you ever noticed in a movie whenever they're doing the credits, the movie's about to start when the director comes up? That's what I always look for, when it says director. All right, we're done. We're going to get the movie. So the director of the book of life, but the director of the book of Esther is God. And if you rolled the credits, he certainly would get credit for what takes place in the book of Esther, but he's not named. In the book of Ruth, he's barely mentioned. That doesn't have anything to do with the fact that they're named after women, I don't think. Maybe I'll find out differently one day, but it's just the fact that God is working behind the scenes in our lives, and God gives us a couple of books in the Bible to remind us of that. That particularly in this age of faith, that there are times when you don't see God moving in your life like you would want to, because he moves. Job chapter 23 says, behold, he's on my left hand, but I cannot see him. And he's on my right hand, and I cannot behold him. I look forward and I look backward, and he's not there, but he knoweth the way that I take. When I'm tried, I shall come forth as gold. So God's working in your life, and you may not be aware of it. You may not be able even to document it. But at the end of your life, you're going to look back, maybe at the judgment seat of Christ, and you're going to look and go, man, God's certainly working in my life. I don't want to bore you with world history, but I'm reading that book, and of course, Germans, and my ancestry is part German, part British, part Scottish, but my name is German, so that tells me something. And when I read through there, Caesar estimated, he didn't keep a record of it, but he estimated that his army killed 1 million men. Now that may not mean anything to you at first, but my crowd survived. My ancestors survived. And not only did they survive that war, they survived the Revolutionary War, and they got over here somehow, and they survived the Civil War, at least one man, all the way down the line. And the same thing on my mother's side. Guess what? The same for you. It's remarkable you're here. It's a miracle of God you're here. And I told you last week, I'm a nerd. One of the things I want to do and get to heaven is I want to go and trace my line and see how close did it come from my line being wiped out. And it was only by God. I'm not saying just for me to be here, but you get what I mean. The fact that God has a purpose in you being here. Not just me, but you. So now the book of Ruth, let me give you a little history of it. Look back at Judges chapter, just the previous chapter. Chapter 21, verse 25. And it says this more than once in the book of Judges, but it says it here. In those days there was no king in Israel, every man that did that which is right in his own eyes. Now it came to pass, next verse, now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled. So the book of Ruth takes place during the time of the judges. And the time of the judges, if you're familiar at all with how the judges work, Gideon, Samson, others that we could name, Jephthah, everything that's happening in the book of Judges, it's either up or down. It's either revival or it's judgment. And if I were to draw the time of the judges on a line, and we would have highs and lows, and pretty highs and lows. It would be like this, some lasting shorter than others. But it would be 20 years under the rules of the Philistines, for example. And then God would raise up a judge, and that judge would rule for 20 years. And what would happen when the judge died? It was downhill. So they get revival up here, and then down here they backslide, and they get down here, and it's just, what's a good word for it? We'll call it rot. They are down here, and they cry out to God because all the judgment's going against them, and they are under oppression of the Philistines or the Midianites or some other, the Assyrians. They're down there, and they are just under judgment. And what do when they do? They cry out to God. And what does God do? He sends them a deliverer. So that deliverer will come, and sometimes they'll serve a few years. And they might even be a judge that you don't even remember his name. But then there's 3 or 4 that stand out, like Samson and Gideon, Jephthah. They stand out and they bring great deliverance. So that's, if you look at that, that's the time that Ruth, the book of Ruth is written. So that gives you a little history of what's taking place. There's no authority. Everybody is doing that which is right in their own eyes, because now they're supposed to be doing God's law. God's law's not gone anywhere. The law given to Moses was in effect in these days, and they are to be serving God, but they wandered away from the Word of God, and they wander away from the will of God, and they found themselves in judgment. And yet, during all that dark period, and Judges is primarily a dark book with some stars shining through. I heard somebody describe it years ago, and I've adopted this idea about the book of Judges. It's the principle of human collapse. And that simply means if God doesn't regularly intervene in your life, you'll fall apart. And that's what happened in Judges. Whenever they turned from God, then trouble came. When they turned to God, revival came. But they didn't ever learn their lesson. They just kept doing it over and over and over again. And that's, you'll find consistent Christians. I think you guys are consistent Christians. But even among consistent Christians, you have your ups and downs. And you have your times of joy and your times of sorrow. And you, like the Apostle Paul, you can identify the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 7 when he says, that which I would not, that I do, and that which I would do, I do not. So the things I want to do, I don't end up doing. The things I don't want to do, I end up doing. Can you all identify to that testimony? That's Judges. And in that time of Judges, this little book, you're in a desert and there's no water, and all it is heat and sunshine and judgment, and you come along, and up out of that cracked soil comes one little plant. And you wonder, how in the world did that plant ever have the resiliency to crack through that dirt and survive and be resilient enough to not only survive but thrive? And that's the book of Ruth, if I were to describe it to you. It's a lovely little book. Another way to describe it, it's like a shining pearl in a pig pen. Here it is, and you just look down there among all that rot and mess, and you find something and go, wow, that's pretty valuable. So, here we are with the book of Ruth, and Ruth's a beautiful picture, first of all, of God's salvation and redemption. Because Ruth had zero chance. Zero. She didn't have 1 in a million. She didn't have 1 in a billion chance. When I'm telling you, she had no chance of going to heaven. No chance of being redeemed. You say, well, how did she get there? How did she get redeemed if there's zero chance? Well, with God, nothing shall be impossible. So we look at it based upon the law of God, and God says, if you're from Moab, you cannot be redeemed until the 10th generation. How far back do you have to go back to get to 10 generations? Where would that put you? I can go back about 2 generations, not quite. But I had a grandpa born in the 1880s, so I'm almost back to the Civil War. My mom, my dad, and then my grandpa's. 1880. Some of you can probably go back to 1860. Maybe, when your grandparents were born. You know how close you are to the Civil War? At least your great-grandparents, right? Unless your parents had children real quick, and you all had children real quick. So, 10 generations? I'm guessing that's going to get you past. If 2 generations for me takes me back 150 years, what's 10 generations going to do? That's pretty remarkable, isn't it? And she can't get in for 10 generations. That means her children can't, her grandchildren can't, her great-great-grandchildren can't, her great-great-great-grandchildren can't, her great-great-great-great-grandchildren can't, and I could go on. Where are they going to go? Hell. Hell. You know what your Gentile ancestors were doing? If you're English and you come from Britain, or you're French and you came France, you have some French blood in you, or you have German blood like myself. Do you know what they were worshiping at the time of Jesus Christ's birth? You know what they were worshiping? They were not worshiping God. Well, if you're a Roman, if you're from Italy, if you're Italian, then you were worshiping Jupiter and Mars and Venus. And I'm not just saying, well, they sort of gave it some pretense. They were offering sacrifices, not human sacrifices, not the Romans anyway. Now the French, they would offer, through the Druids, they would offer human sacrifice from time to time. So if you got French blood in you, congratulations, your ancestors were into witchcraft. If you're German and you worshipped animals primarily, and if you're from Britain, you worship snakes. You English? Congratulations. Maybe that's why you hate snakes. But none of them worship God. The only people on earth that are worshiping God are the Jews. And of course, before the time of the birth of Christ, they're all full of law and full of pride, and there's the Pharisees and the Sadducees. But here's Ruth, and she has zero chance, and God comes in and redeems her. Redeems her. There are people who have been redeemed and saved that if you look back on their life, you would say that kid never had a chance. I come across them at school, and I would think to myself, this kid does not have a chance with the parents that's got. But of course, that's not true. Everybody's got a chance because God redeems, and God can redeem. Some of the great testimonies of all time are people who've been redeemed. I heard the testimony of a guy who used to be a Hell's Angel, became a great preacher. He preached for me several times, and he was a member of that motorcycle group. And of course, it was a gang, is what it was. You know how they got initiated, at least in his group, how they got initiated? I didn't really believe this when I heard it, but I looked up a little bit about it. Why would he lie to me? But it's just so hard to believe that you go, man, nobody would ever do that. So what they would do is they get on their motorcycles, and this is a lost man, right? Dies, he goes to hell. The way they initiated them into their group is they get an 18-wheeler coming this way, and they'd be following an 18-wheeler, and when those two pass, that motorcycle will go right between them. And they live to tell about it. I think about that sometimes when I see two truck drivers going, that wind in there, that tunnel. He said, it's the greatest thrill in all your life. I said, have at it, buddy, have at it. I don't want that kind of thrill. Just lead me to the roller coasters. No thanks. That guy got saved, and he could have been, every time, killed doing something dumb like that. And how many dumb things have you done in your life? Maybe not to that degree, but how many dumb things have you done in your life? And God's redeemed you, because that's what this story's about. That's why you love the book of Ruth. It's a great short story. And you love little short stories, whether it's Aesop's fables or something like that. But you can't find anything sweeter than the book of Ruth. So, first, it's a book of redemption. I'm just doing an introduction this morning. We're not going to get into the scriptures so much. I'm giving you an overview. It also shows God works supernaturally in our lives. Just as I said, it was impossible for Ruth to get into the family of God. And how she did is explained in the book of Ruth, which we'll talk about beginning next time with chapter 1. But the fact that God has supernaturally acted in your life as well. The things that he arranged in order for you to get saved, whether it was having you born into the family you were born into, or being born in the country in which you were born, or to have you born in a particular area of the country where you were born. Do you realize your chances of being saved would be less if you lived in another part of the country? Just because the gospel isn't preached as prevalently, prominently as it has been in the South. It's one thing I'm so thankful for, that I grew up in the Bible Belt. You know, they use that to make fun of us, but thank God. I mean, there's how many Baptist churches are there? In Tennessee and North Carolina and Georgia and Alabama and Kentucky and I guess Arkansas, Missouri, Oklahoma is pretty strong with Baptist churches. And that gospel's been, you can't go anywhere without the gospel. Now, take that same thing and go to Detroit or New York City or San Francisco. And to find a Christian there is going to be. So, thank God for where you're born. God supernaturally works in our lives. And all of you could give a testimony to that. And I've already mentioned, God is mentioned just a few times. So, Ruth is a Moabite, and the Moabite idea here, look at verse 1. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Now, his wife's name we'll learn is Naomi. But all I want to do this morning in closing is to look at the word Moab. And let's find out about Moab. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 19, and we will find the history of Moab and who these people are. It is modern day Jordan, Moab. Ammon and Moab are in the same area. They are east of the Jordan River, and you can look them up. Genesis chapter 19, the Lord brings judgments against Sodom and Gomorrah, and Lot and his 2 daughters flee. Remember, his wife turned around and became a pillar of salt. So now they are on the run, and they've suffered great tragedy. They've lost everything, not unlike Job. He's lost 2 daughters and he's lost his wife. And so the way that he begins to, it's not anything new. The way he begins to try to cope with this is he starts drinking. He's using alcohol as his antidepressant, which is the worst thing in the world you can do, because alcohol is a depressant. So you think it's going to make you feel better. It doesn't make you feel better. It makes you feel numb. Now, I'm not speaking from experience, okay? I don't know anything about it except what I've been told. But anyway, you tell people you got liver disease, you know what they think. They think, well, he must have been hitting the sauce pretty good over the years. No, I had a half a beer once. Half a beer once. Wish I'd never half a beer. Say, well, why did you have a half a beer? That's a strange thing. Because I had a kidney stone, and this Yahoo at church told me that if I drank a beer, I'd get rid of that kidney stone. I didn't go buy it. He went to the store and Convenient Mart and brought me that beer. I don't even remember what it was. Whatever it was, I'd rather drink swamp water. I'd rather drink swamp water. When that thing hit my mouth, I went, this is the worst tasting stuff did they get that out of a muddy creek? That's terrible. How do you people drink it?
One
One at a time. Let's say you develop a taste for it, but anyway, I drank about half of it toward it. I said, I'd rather have kidney stones because stuff. So anyway, we all have our vices and we all have our trouble. Well, Lot became a drunkard afterwards. How do we know that? Well, look, verse 34 of chapter 19, it came to pass on the morrow that the firstborn said to the younger, no, let's back up. I'm missing it. Verse 32, come, let us make our father drink wine and we will lie with him that we may preserve the seed of our father. And they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father. And he perceived not when she lay down, nor when she arose. Now they tell me if you drink so much, you can't remember what happened the night before. That's what they tell me. And I've had conversations with drunks that I'll tell them the next day what they've said to me, and they'll say, I never said that. Oh, you said it. You said it. So verse 35, and they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger arose and lay with him, and he perceived not when she lay down or when she arose. Thus were both the daughters of Lot with child by their father, and the firstborn bare a son, and called his name Moab. 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 So where does Ruth come from? She comes from Lot's daughter and Lot himself. She's a descendant of Lot. All right, twice. We're out of time, so I'm just going to give you the references, all right? Twice in the book of Psalms, Psalm 60, verse 8, and Psalm 108, verse 9, tells us this: Moab is my washpot. Moab is my washpot. Now, there's ways you can describe that without me having to go into much detail. You know what a washpot is. It's not like a clean washing machine of modern day. It's really, imagine a dirty sink where you've had your Thanksgiving meal and you stack the dishes. Of course, most don't do that now. They wash them off, put them in the dishwasher. So just stick with me, like the old days. The sink is full of dirty dishes and you start to wash the dishes. Have you ever washed dishes where the water gets so dirty you have to drain it and start with new water? Done that? That's Moab. Moab is my washpot. So I'm going to use Moab to clean up dirty things. The Bible talks in the New Testament about having vessels of honor and vessels of dishonor. Every house has vessels of honor and vessels of dishonor. In your house, you have vessels of honor. You may have, is this a thing in the day gone by? But it used to be that you had a china cabinet and you had the china in the cabinet. And when did you eat that china? Well, in my house, we never did. That was for a special occasion. We never had a special occasion. But that's vessels of honor. It's so special, we're never getting them down and we're eating with them. And you know why? Because Mama was afraid somebody would break them. Okay. But you also have vessels of dishonor. And a vessel of dishonor in your house would say not to be too. But your commode is a vessel of dishonor. Does that make sense? So, if you had to be something in the house of God, would you rather be the china or the commode? And God says, you're either vessels of honor or vessels of dishonor. It's okay to be used. I mean, thank God you got indoor toilets. My grandparents didn't. My parents didn't. Thank God you got indoor toilets. Many of you can say the same thing about your parents or grandparents. So it's good to have it. Thank God you got it. But it's not a place that you want to hang out. Have guests come over and say, hey, would you like to go in the bathroom? Sit around for a while? No. But would you like to eat from the fine china? Oh, absolutely, because you're my honored guest. Vessels of honor, vessels of dishonor. Well, Moab is a vessel of dishonor. He's the washpot. And you'll see how that works in the coming weeks, okay?